And
Welcome.
you're going to record, right?
I just hit record. So we
Fantastic.
are starting week 2 of Words That Tell the Truth. So this is our Lenten series for this year. And we are focusing on the poetry that is a part of our faith and a part of the Bible. So this is a class that is for people who are super into poetry. If it is just your bread and butter to read poetry, to meditate on it. It is also a class for those who do not read poetry, who do not find, Dixon has given a thumbs up, that just don't necessarily have it as your go-to thing that you like to read. I'm in that category. I don't normally just pick up poetry and read it when I want to read something. I'll pick up a novel, give me a memoir, give me even nonfiction before I would pick up poetry. But we're really getting into how poetry is for everyone because it is a part of the Bible. It's all throughout the Bible. It's a way that God's people have talked to God and about God since the beginning of time. And we are here to really stretch that muscle a little bit and to read poetry differently than we read other types of scripture, and to learn how to look for things in poetry that can give us some sense of grounding in our faith. Last week, we talked about T.S. Eliot, the poem Ash Wednesday that he wrote about his conversion to Christianity. And so that was actually one of the main themes of our discussion was conversion and the journey that everybody takes between recognizing how far they have come from, how far they have gotten off the path, and how they have come back to God and been converted to that new life. And we talked about how that's a process that happens over and over again for all of us in our journey in faith. Let me share my screen and pull up my little keynote for you. So we are going to be talking a bit about Emily Dickinson this week and the Gospel of John. Mark has a Bible study, kind of overview Bible study of the Gospel of John for us. And if I had to pick a theme, if last week was about conversion, this week is going to be, oh wait, can't get my, there it goes. Okay. This week's theme is going to be about God's hiddenness and God's mystery, and to ask the questions about the identity of God. Who is God, and what is God like? That is a question that doesn't just come up when you are pressured for an answer, like when you're suffering, when you really need God and you don't know where he is. This is a question that we ask when we are children. It's one of those first developmental parts of our faith is to say, well, what does God look like? Who is God? Where is God's house? Where does God live? What does it look like? And the childhood notions of the great bearded grandfather sitting on a throne in the sky is something that we conceive of because we need images. We need images for God that we can connect to. So today we're going to be exploring the ways that we talk about God and names that we have for God, and really arriving at what do we do with God's hiddenness when that hiddenness turns into something more like absence. What do we do when God seems absent from us and from creation? So we're going to be looking at 2 different poems from Emily Dickinson and, like I said, a few parts of the Gospel of John. Now, before we get into the poems from Emily, I want to do just a very quick biography of her because I think her story is important for us to understand her poetry. So super quick, Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. She was from a pretty prominent family. Her father was an attorney and also a politician. It's said that she lived modestly because there were some times when they had some economic difficulty, but I would actually say they were affluent because she was able to live at home and be cared for. She had everything she needed to write and to not have to make a living from her writing. She attended Amherst Academy and Mount Holyoke Female Seminary until age 18. That word seminary kind of stuck out at me until I realized in doing a little bit of study of her that female seminary was sort of like a Christian academy for young people, kind of like a youth camp, where she continued in her studies of things like science and biology and also philosophy, rhetoric, theology, that kind of thing. But she only lived in that community until about age 18. She was only there for like a year and a half, and then she moved home. They don't really know exactly why she was taken out of that school, but it's implied that she had some kind of like mental health issue, maybe some depression or anxiety. Her father took her out of that school, and then she lived at home all the way through adulthood. And while she lived at home, she began writing. And one of the things that all of us remember from school and learning about Emily Dickinson is that she was reclusive. She was famously reclusive through her like late young adulthood to middle age up until her death. But that seclusion that she had, and possibly maybe some pathology there, like maybe she was agoraphobic of being outside and being kind of exposed and vulnerable. During that time, she wrote, and she wrote prolifically. She is, one of the most well-known poets of in American history. And those poems were influenced by a lot of things. So she was a part of a generation that was really influenced by Calvinism. But this is not in the middle of the Reformation. This is late Calvinism, post-Puritanism, and distilled down into kind of the society culture of repression. This was the crucible in which temperance was a big movement. Where there were a lot of implied social rules for propriety for men and for women, and for participating in things like church and faith. The Whig culture is a part of this. So the Whigs were a political party that dissolved right before the Civil War. But much like our political parties today, they had an influence on culture. So the Whig culture, and I was looking this up in my book, which the resource I'm using is Emily Dickinson, The Art of Belief, wonderful book, and mostly biography of Emily Dickinson. So the Whig political culture was the triumph over of the cosmopolitan and national over the provincial and local, over rational order, over irrational spontaneity, and of self-control over self-expression. So this is the foil in which Emily Dickinson lived and wrote. She also had a lot of experiences with death from a pretty early age. And culturally, people treated death very differently than we do now. When a person was sick and dying, their friends and family would gather around them and hold vigil with them while they were laying in the bed there. And so from an early age, Emily had these experiences of death that shaped how she saw human frailty and human finitude. She also is, a person that was, of the generation of the Civil War, which was met with a lot of enthusiasm initially, much like most war, that everyone assumed that it would be nice and easy and quick, and the right side would prevail, and it would be a swift victory. And they had no idea that it was going to take years and years and have so many long repercussions and cultural implications. And so during all of that time is when she was writing poetry. She never married, and she also never converted to Christianity. That was something that was another cultural thing that she fought against, where the Congregationalist church that was in Amherst really had the kind of You became a Christian when you shared your story and your testimony, and kind of had this moment of, here is my life and here is how Jesus has changed it all. And it was a public kind of declaration. Emily Dickinson did not do public. And so converting to Christianity and participating in the life of the church was just not her jam. However, she was definitely a person of faith. She wrote a great deal of poetry about her faith, her struggles, and about God and Jesus. So what I want to do is to read one of her poems right now that has emphasis on some of that struggle and some of that, what we are naming as our theme, the hiddenness of God. Emily is in this poem sitting down to pray, and this is sort of her experience of God in that moment. Now, I want to also invite you to consider these questions as we read. What images come to mind as you listen? What literary devices are being used here? If you know about that, any of that stuff, how is she convincing us of her point by her writing? How is this poem creating an emotional landscape, which is another way of saying, how does it make you feel? But it's also like, sometimes poetry doesn't make you feel anything because it's about another person's story, or you're called to be a witness to another person's emotions. So is there an emotional landscape in this poem, and are you a part of it? And then finally, what is this poem inviting you or the world in general to do? Is there a change that's being invited, even a mental shift that the poem invites you to do? As I read, I'd love for you to put in the chat box if something jumps out at you, like a word or a phrase from this poem. Put it in the chat box. We won't have time to just openly discuss until the end of our time together, but I would love to see your feedback now. So let me read. My period had come for prayer. No other art would do. My tactics missed a rudiment. Creator, was it you? God grows above. So those who pray, horizons must ascend. And so I stepped upon the north to see this curious friend. His house was not, no sign had he, by chimney nor by door. Could I infer his residence, vast prairies of air, unbroken by a settler, were all that I could see. Infinitude, hadst thou no face that I might look on thee? The silence condescended, creation stopped for me. But awed beyond my errand, I worshipped, did not pray. So there's a lot going on here in this poem. I want to see what you've written in the chat. So I'm gonna stop the share and just pull up the chat box. If there's anything that y'all want to lift up, I will definitely, while you're thinking of things that may have struck you. The naming of God as this curious friend. So she starts out the poem by talking about God, the creator. The curious friend, capital C, capital F, is something that comes up in a lot of her poems when she gives names to God. She is really struggling with prayer in this poem. And I want to mention that she uses parody as a part of her writing quite a bit. It's an image of, she doesn't mean any disrespect, I don't think, but parody is a part of her poetry in a way of kind of holding lightly the practices of the church. So this is an old medieval style from the Middle Ages about parody in the Christian faith was actually a purpose. There was a purpose of renewal to it. So on feast and festival days, the serious language and ritualistic practices of the Christian faith were held up for laughter and ridicule. It was an invitation for people to kind of hold lightly the practices of the faith after a period of fasting. And you hear some of this tone come up in Emily's poem. And I want to pull it back up so we can see it. Let's see. So my tactics missed a rudiment, creator, was it you? And this tone of I have to sit down and pray. Here I am doing the work of prayer, but something's missing. Is it God? So there's this like kind of sense of humor here. She's almost kind of being a bit cheeky with God in that first stanza. And in looking at this kind of name for God, this curious friend, who is this weirdo that's not showing up to my prayers, is kind of what she's saying. There's also this kind of continued struggle with the identity of God, where she is talking a little bit about the in the names infinitude and the silence. And let me look in the chat. I was seeing a little bit of conversation about that. The hats now, no face. Margie, thank you for that. That's the sense here that what do I call this thing that I'm praying to? And she comes up with infinitude and silence because she can't see him. Stacey says, I love the intimacy of creation stopped for me. Okay, so we're going to get into this when we talk a little bit about the Gospel of John and the Word made flesh. But to say that there's a relationship of the silence that stops with the capital W word. When silence stops, obviously sound comes. And what is that sound? It is Christ. Let's see. And then Anne is pulling out that she was focusing on worship. Okay, so she moves from doing this kind of work of prayer, which is about her and about her words and her kind of sense of me, and then shifting to this posture of worship where she says, I am awed beyond my errand. I worshiped, I did not pray. And that is something that I think is important for us to pay attention to for our own instruction in prayer and in worship. So I want to leave us with this sense of the question of, is there an identity in God that is beyond words? How do we pray to God when we're not sure what shape God takes? So to kind of address that question, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk a little bit about the Gospel of John. And I say a little bit because there's so much to say about this gospel that we were trying to kind of funnel it down, and he's got some good stuff to share.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, I mean, yeah, it's too bad there's not anything going on. It's the simplest book in the entire Bible. Really, no. I mean, and but just to give one snapshot among many, many possible snapshots, here is my disclaimer so that Dixon doesn't pick a fight with me. And I'll say this again, there are many different ways to interpret the Gospel of John. I'm going to lead us through just very briefly one of these many possible ways of interpretation and digging in, which I think it works well for us because I'm going to take the approach of poetry with this gospel, and argue that it is a poetic gospel. Sarah, I'm glad that we focused on that Emily Dickinson poem and left it with these notions of God is hidden, and who is the silence, and what does God look like? And I think that there's a great irony at work. Irony is a good word for the Gospel of John, because one of the themes is this idea of, like I have here in the subtitle, God hidden in plain sight, mysticism and paradox. and that we see a recurring theme throughout this gospel of asking the question, what does God look like? God is unseeable, and yet at the same time, God is completely seeable through the lens of the person of Jesus. And from off the bat, in the first chapter of this gospel, we're confronted with, we encounter this notion of the word. It becomes very important. This first point. This is my own. I'm not quoting anybody else. I just pulled this out of my brain. Each of the four gospels kind of has its own focus, and while the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we often consider together as a set, what we call the Synoptic Gospels. They share a framework and a skeleton and an outline, and are self-referential to each other in certain ways. And while most likely the fourth gospel, so as John is sometimes referred to as the fourth gospel, it stands apart from that synoptic tradition. It most likely, the compilers and editors and writers of it were familiar with the synoptic gospels. It follows its own structure. It follows its own outline separate from them. But this is a handy way that I've thought about considering them. If we look at the Gospel of Matthew being sort of like a moral biography, it's about the life of Jesus, but there's lots of instruction along the way. We can see the Gospel of Mark. It's almost like bullet points. It's like a screenplay for a movie or a drama. And the Gospel according to St. Luke, the longest of the four, it's like a novel. But if we think about these, which are all just metaphorical ways of approaching them, John's Gospel is the epic poem of the four. It is the poetry recounting. And everything in this book is a metaphor, but at the same time, everything in this book is also more than a metaphor. It's using poetic language, metaphorical, allegorical language to point to things that for the writer of this gospel are capital T truth. We also have a biblical book here that is the product of layers and layers of editing. It is the product of a community for whom this was their text about Jesus. But the oldest fragment of the New Testament that has survived is a fragment of a piece of paper that is from the Gospel of John. It dates to sometime in the 2nd century, but even at that date, we see something that is the product of editing multiple times. There's lots of scholarly debate about this book, probably as much as any other book in the Bible. The Gospel of John has caused more arguments between scholars about its provenance and its origins. But there's a way of looking at it, and the gospel itself makes this claim that at its core there's a kernel of an eyewitness account at work, and that the person who first began generating the text that became the Gospel of John as we have it was an eyewitness to these events, and they make that claim themselves about it, and then it's layered on top of itself from there. As I said, there are many ways to read and interpret this gospel. It's short enough that you can sit down and read it at one go. And it is dense enough that you can spend your entire life trying to unpack it and make sense of it. We have different kinds of speech here. The sense of prophetic utterance, that the ways that Jesus talks in this gospel, at first blush, seem like ways that people don't speak to each other, but that's intentional, that Jesus is speaking from this sense of prophetic utterance. There is this notion of mystery, divine mystery, things that are beyond our understanding. And yet at the same time, the Gospel of John presents certain aspects about Jesus that are the most visceral, that are the most human and vulnerable and earthy of anything of Jesus in any of the four Gospels. This is the gospel where Jesus weeps. This is the gospel where Jesus physically eats food with his friends and uses the word friends. This is the gospel where Jesus takes mud to enact healing for people. So there's this both and. It's this paradox of transcendent and very earthly human. So there's this sense of infinitude, to use Emily Dickinson's word. And how do we approach infinitude through Jesus being on earth. And that is this notion of the big word for John is the logos, which is a Greek word. This gospel was written in the Greek language. And in English, most of our English translations that I am aware of, the logos is translated as the word. But it's more than just a word. If we look at how other languages treat logos, in the Latin Bible, it's translated as verbum, which we might look at that and recognize our own word verb, an action word in language. The Spanish Bible translates logos as el verbo, which literally means the verb. So in the beginning was the verb, and that might make some bells go off on our heads. There's something going on with this notion of word that's not just a collection of letters, but it's something active in the world. And through that active thing, infinitude becomes finite. There's a really cool thing going on structurally that a number of different scholars have pointed out. And there are different ways to look at this. Some of what I'm going to do here is helped by how the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright has considered these 7 days of creation from the book of Genesis being recast in the way that John's gospel is put together. We get this right out of the gate from the very first verse, in the beginning. You see that. I will always remember when I was a kid in high school in Quiz Bowl, and there was a question of the Quiz Bowl: which book of the Bible begins in the beginning? Everybody dinged their little thing to buzz in and answer, and said Genesis. And the Quiz Bowl moderator said, well, you didn't let me finish the question. Which book of the Bible begins in the beginning was the Word? John's gospel is the only other book of the Bible that has the same introductory phrase as the book of Genesis does. So right out of the gate, we're thinking, okay, there's something going on here. What is it? Well, the first chapter of Genesis recounts that in a poetic way, the creation of the universe through the 7 days. And then in the Gospel of John, we have multiple layers of ways that the author is playing with that idea of the days of creation, arguing that through Jesus, there's a new creation. There are 6 signs in the Gospel of John, miracles that are referred to as signs. And some scholars have pointed out that these signs are mirroring the days of creation. So we have the wedding at Cana where Jesus turns water to wine, the healing of the centurion's servant, the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, the feeding of the 5,000, the healing of the man who not only was blind, but was in fact born blind, and the raising of Lazarus from the dead. 6 signs mirroring the 6 days. But then you say, well, wait a minute, aren't there actually 7 days of creation? Where's the 7th sign? Why are there only 6 signs? Well, there is a 7th sign, which for the Gospel of John is the most important sign of all, which is the cross. And if in reading the creation account in Genesis, we see that on the 7th day, God completed the creation and God rested. The rest of God, that Sabbath completion, is work and is the culmination of creation. So too for the Gospel of John, Jesus on the cross completes the new creation. At the end of the creation narrative in Genesis, the writer says, God finished the work that God did in creation. So too from the cross, Jesus says, it is finished. So there's this tie, this poetic tie between Genesis and the Jesus story with creation. There are many other ways of looking at this creation thing. I'm going to show you very briefly just one more of many. I think this is so cool how that when you kind of see the structure, and the more you start to look for it when you're reading the Gospel of John, the more you see it popping up everywhere. Just kind of like how last week I was saying, the more times I read T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday, the more stuff I see going on in it. So too with the Gospel of John. It's just so cool how this is everywhere. We can see these parallels. On the first day in Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, let there be light. Well, in the Gospel of John, at the very beginning in the prologue, he makes it very clear that God created the universe through the Logos, through Jesus, and that Jesus, in fact, is the light that God. Let there be light. Jesus is the light. On day 2, let the waters in the heavens be separated from the waters in the earth and the firmament. So there's the separation of waters. On John, towards the end of the first chapter, as we get into chapter 2 of John, we have the phrase, the next day, echoing, okay, there was a first day, now we're on a second day. And it's all about Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist in water. And then the gospel goes on to talk about the baptism of John and the baptism of Jesus and his disciples. The baptisms are being separated, like these waters are being separated. Day 3, let the earth bring forth fruit. On John, as the narrative in the gospel continues, the wedding at Cana, that narrative begins by the writer saying, on the third day, Jesus went to a wedding at Cana, where he turned water into wine, wine as a symbol of the fruit of the vine. So we have this idea of fruits coming forth in a new way. This next one, the day 4, God made the sun and the moon as signs to rule the skies. And I should say at this point that yes, the book of Genesis was written in Hebrew. However, the version of Genesis that the readers and editors of John's gospel would have known would have been the version of Genesis that was in the Greek language. And in the Greek language, the word semia is the plural, semeion is the singular for sign. And after Jesus' baptism, after the wedding at Cana, the Pharisees start showing up and asking Jesus questions. And they say, show us a sign to point to who you are claiming to be. And they use the same word that's used in Genesis 1 for sign here. And what Jesus says to them is, I will be lifted up. He's referring to his crucifixion, but thinking poetically about lifting up, it's paralleling the sun rising in the sky. Day 5, God brings forth living creatures from the water. After this, we get John chapter 3, Jesus and Nicodemus. Jesus says to Nicodemus, everyone must be born of water and the Spirit to truly live. So life coming out of the waters. Day 6, God creates humankind in his image and likeness. There's a lot going on in John's gospel with this notion of the 6th day. At the 6th hour, the gospel tells us, Jesus meets with the Samaritan woman at the well. And in this dialogue with the Samaritan woman, he is giving her new life in him. Also, 6 days before the Passover is the raising of Lazarus from the dead, new life of humanity. And something I think is really cool, at the end of the creation narrative in Genesis, when God breathes into Adam the breath of life. We don't see that happening ever again. There's an oblique reference in Ezekiel with the dry bones, but the next time we see a person in the position of being God breathing on people, it is Jesus breathing onto the disciples the Holy Spirit after the resurrection. So once again, all these parallels happening, and finally, on the 7th day that we already mentioned with the cross, we also see Jesus constantly healing on the Sabbath throughout John's gospel, showing that just like a close reading of the creation narrative in Genesis, God does work on the 7th day. Sabbath rest is part of the action of creation. So too, on the Sabbath, on the day of rest, God is still working in the world to make it perfect and complete, because Sabbath equals completion and perfection. So I want you to consider this as something that's going on with John's gospel, but it's also, this is poetry. It's pointing to truth beyond just, the fact that I brushed my teeth was a true event this morning. I did brush my teeth, Dixon. But that there's a poetic truth at work.
Can I just interrupt and just say how stinking cool this is? Like, I'm just so blown away by this. And every time that Mark and I have talked about this and we pick up the Gospel of John and we look at, like, there are phrases that begin many of the chapters that notice what day it is.
Yeah. And there's one more big one that I should add here, and that's in chapter 20 with the resurrection.
Yes.
That chapter begins at the first day of the week while it was still dark. And that's how he sets up the resurrection. And this is where we get the ancient Christian notion of the 8th day, that the first day is the first new day, and there is in fact an eighth day of creation, which is the resurrection of Jesus, bringing in the perfection of creation. And on the evening of the first day of the week, when Mary Magdalene goes back to tell the disciples about what she has seen at the empty tomb, that language of the evening of the day also brings us back to Genesis chapter 1, because it was evening and it was morning, the completion of the day. So this stuff is all chalked through this gospel. It's everywhere. So as you read it, look for it. There's something else I want you to look for when you read the Gospel of John. And that is, Jesus is not just Jesus, full stop. Jesus is all kind of things with all kind of names and titles that the text and that other people in the text give him, as well as names and titles that he gives himself. I'm not going to go through each one of these, other than on the second column at the bottom, something else in John chapter 20, when Mary Magdalene's in the garden looking for Jesus, and Jesus starts talking to him, she thinks he is the gardener. That's another reference back to the creation in Genesis. God created a garden in chapter 2 and placed the humans in the garden. And here is Jesus in the garden acting like a gardener. One of the many ways that John is telling us over and over and over again, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ, is God, the Creator, God the Father, through all of these different ways of approaching it. And Jesus himself, there's a series of sayings where he says, I am blank. I am the Messiah, is the first one he says in the gospel. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. In chapter 8, the Pharisees are asking him, they're having one of these debates with him, and he says, before Abraham was, I am. That is pointing to the name that God gave Moses in the book of Exodus. I need a name to take to Pharaoh. God says, will you tell Pharaoh that I am who I am, sent you? Jesus says here, I am. He is underscoring his identity in this way. Some of these are pretty oblique. What does it mean for Jesus to be a door or a gate for the sheep? What does it mean for Jesus to be a vine? This is poetry, but this is poetry pointing to some deeper truth that we're being invited to meditate on and spend time with, trying to unfold this deeper mystery of this mystical presence and truth of who God is. Again, hiddenness, the constant refrain, people, both his disciples and others, saying, show us God, show us the Father. And Jesus saying, well, God can't be seen, God hasn't been seen, except if you've seen me. As the King James Version that Emily Dickinson would have been reading says, he that hath seen me hath seen the Father. I am how you know the unknowable. I am how you can approach infinitude. I am giving a voice to the silence. As Emily Dickinson referenced, the silence condescended. Jesus is both close to and separate from. He says to Mary in the garden, do not touch me. But he also says to Thomas after the resurrection, place your hands on my wounds, knowing and unknowing, approachable and distant at the same time. So there's metaphor, but there's metaphor pointing to deeper truths that go beyond words. Jesus is the capital W word, and yet there's something beyond words at the same time. This is just a tiny little slice of what's going on, but I do invite you to consider looking at the Gospel of John through this lens of metaphor and more than metaphor.
Yeah, and I want to, while we are talking a bit about the person of Jesus, so Emily Dickinson struggled quite a bit with the concept of God the Father. The God, the infinitude of God, and the text that I'm reading really kind of pulls out that her struggle with God was in this kind of like faux relationship. But if God the Father was like her foe, then God the Son was her trustworthy friend. And this is something that I liken with a lot of what Mark is saying about the Gospel of John, is that it's as though the Gospel of John is taking the concept of infinitude and God the Creator, and helping us connect and helping us understand who Jesus is, and not only what Jesus's work is, what Jesus accomplishes, but who Jesus is to us and will continue to be for us. And so I want to present one more poem for us to look at together. This is, there it is, okay. So this is a poem, we just finished this one. The second poem is going to be about that person of Jesus. So I'll read aloud and I'll invite your comments to meditate on. Okay. Life is what we make it. Death we do not know. Christ's acquaintance with him justify him, though. He would trust no stranger, other could betray. Just his own endorsement that sufficeth me. All the other distance he hath traversed first. No new mile remaineth far as paradise. His sure foot preceding, tender pioneer. Base must be the coward, dare not venture now. I want to invite your own comments in the chat box about this. While you're thinking, I'm going to pull out just a few things that are important to pay attention to. And this was true of the last poem that I read about worship and prayer, that Emily Dickinson uses what's called slant rhyme, which is not perfect rhyme, but when you look at the word, it might sometimes sort of match up. And slant rhyme usually makes you're anticipating a kind of resolution sound to the stanza, but you don't hear it, and so you hear the word. It makes you jump. And so, like, say here in the last poem, she ends it with creation stopped for me, but on beyond my errand I worshipped, did not pray. So she's not trying to rhyme that the way that the other stanzas have rhymed, and it says something about what she wants us to pay attention to. So this comes up definitely in this third stanza here, where it says, all the other distance he had traversed first, no new mile remaineth far as paradise. Paradise is emphasized there. Isn't that interesting? The other thing I want you to pay attention to is the tender pioneer. So Margie has already lifted up this one, the tender pioneer. So the two words together are a literary device called a kenning, Kenning, kenning. And this is a style and figurative language for a metaphor. It's a two-word compound metaphor or name. And you see it show up in like Old Norse, Icelandic, Old English poetry. And it gives a special emphasis for something that has a name beyond a name. And we saw it in this poem where she calls God the curious friend. And then in the second poem, Jesus is the tender pioneer. And she does this in a lot of her poetry, where she talks about how, Jesus, the person, she has this intense relationship with. And so the name that she has for him is very cryptic and very loving at the same time. So that kenning is important for us to pay attention to, because she wants us to see an image for Christ. Let me just look at the chat box really quick. And it's true. Anne is saying that the tender shepherd is also kind of in there too. Sort of the overlap of John's gospel that says the good shepherd with the tender pioneer, and does not make us go alone over unknown ground. This is exactly my point. I think that that's important about the person of Jesus. Bringing forth fruit in day 3, and there's also a reference to the wedding couple and new life. So Zan is as talking about the Gospel of John there, and that's wonderful observation, Zan. And then far as paradise, his sure foot proceeding. So there's something about this poem, I think, that is really about this like journey, this kind of adventure that we are invited to go on. Life is what we make it, death we do not know. We are entering into this holy journey with Christ. And I think that the kind of takeaway for me in looking at this is to think about that tender pioneer going across unknown territory. Imagine say like Lewis and Clark, going out and pioneering into an area, into a place where we may one day go, and covering all that distance ahead of us. And I think that's a devotional invitation for us, is to think about where Christ has gone, is all ahead of us, and that there is nothing that we face in our lives, no suffering, no event that Jesus has not experienced himself. And I want to leave us with, I want to open up the floor for just kind of questions and kind of conversation. And we did start a little late, so we'll go till about 12:05, I think. But before we start talking, I do want to share just some takeaways for y'all to kind of think about in the week to come, for your own kind of reflection. So going to the first poem, how might we think of God as this curious friend, the one whose identity is all about silence and awe and mystery? And can we get comfortable with God's silence? Is there a way in which that silence is still friendship, it's curious friendship, but it's still friendship and intimacy? And then, do you have some terrain that you are crossing that's a little bit scary? Is there something in your own life? Is there a truth that needs to be told about the terrain ahead of you? And is there a way that thinking about Jesus as the tender pioneer of that terrain help you? Does it change your thinking about what you were facing? And then finally, here's the fun challenge for the rest of Lent. Think about reading the Gospel of John and kind of looking at some of the things that Mark shared with us about the names for Jesus, the names for God that come up all throughout the Gospel of John, the journey through the retelling of the creation story. Look for those Easter eggs throughout your reading. And when you find them, maybe write them down and think about using them in your prayers. Like, what would it be like if you came to morning prayer every morning, having read a little bit of the Gospel of John, and you had in your mind, like, as we were praying, today I pray will be thinking of the Good Shepherd, or the Word made flesh, or the way, the truth, the life. Whatever it is, kind of integrating a different name for Jesus into your prayer practice every single day. So that's kind of your take home work, if you want to. It's not something we're going to revisit, but I think that it's kind of cool to sit down and read a book of the Bible and to have something to look for. And it definitely keeps my attention and helps me focus a little bit. But it's also a way that we can shift our thinking and be able to change a little bit when we are struggling with God's hiddenness, and even feeling like God is absent, and having some names for God that connect us to images that make sense to us.
Sara, if I could put in a real quick plug also, just as a fun other thing along with reading the Gospel of John, if you're looking for perhaps a new angle with the Gospel of John, I'm going to give a little shout out to a book that I absolutely love. Some of you may be familiar with the writer Reynolds Price. who passed away just a few years ago. He was a novelist and an author and a literature professor at our alma mater at Duke. But he wrote a book called Three Gospels, which include his own translation as a novelist of the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John from the Greek, a very kind of literal literary translation from the Greek of John's Gospel. And it's a fascinating read. He doesn't have any chapter and verse in there. It's just the text. So I definitely would say read John's Gospel in the Bible that you have at home. But if you want another approach to it at the same time, Reynolds Price's translation of John's Gospel in this book, Three Gospels, is a really cool read, and you can do it in an hour or two and read the whole thing.
Nice. Thank you.
A link to the Amazon page.
Thank you, Dixon. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
And the third one of the Three Gospels is his own retelling of the gospel story, which is apparently a project he had. He always taught a class on the Gospels, and the final project for the class was always to have his students write their own gospel. So that's what his third one in there is. But the John's Gospel is right in the middle, and it's really cool. And it goes into all of that, the names of the titles of Jesus as avenues for prayer and reflection.
So I want to turn it over to you all now. If there's any kind of reflection about anything that we've shared today, either of the two poems that we've explored or some of Mark's study of the Gospel of John that you'd like to lift up to share with the community, or any questions that you have. You can either just physically raise your hand if your camera is on, or put your name in the chat, and we'll make space to talk.
Could you ask my mom a question about T.S. Eliot? I am kind of interested in.
I've heard that moms don't like that.
I've never heard that.
Jane is asking about, so the book that I referred to is called Emily Dickinson, The Art of Belief. They're the two poems that we studied today are in here, and Stacy was asking me kind of privately in the chat where you can find the poems that I read. Emily's poems are on the Wikipedia, WikiLinks page, but they are not titled. So you usually need to know a phrase from the poem in order to look it up. So the poem that I read, the first one on God, my period came for prayer. That's usually the title that's given to it because it's just the first line of the poem. But in any event, that's a wonderful book that is in the St. Paul's Library. And I was telling everybody that John Shield's sermon from 2006 is stuck in the front. Yeah.
Stacy's got a question about the word base in the second poem.
Oh, wonderful question. So base means gross, like that means that's not a positive connotation kind of word. And let's see, I can go back to the presentation if y'all want to look at that poem again. Sorry, that's the second poem. So she's talking about in the last stanza here, his sure foot preceding tender pioneer, base must be the coward, dare not venture now. So when she says base, she means terrible, bad, gross. Terrible must be the coward, dare not venture now. And I think what she means is that the person who is unable to take those steps to follow Jesus, or to go on that journey into unknown territory, knowing that it has already been crossed first by Christ, so she calls that person a coward, who dares not venture in those footsteps behind Jesus. I'll leave that up. I know it's much easier to look at the poem as we're kind of meditating together, so I don't want to don't mean to switch back and forth quite so much, but any other thoughts or reflections? Okay.
Oh, we've got a great comment from Jean down here now.
Thinking about God as an infinitude of silence, and that to enter into the silence is to be utterly exposed. Oh, Jean, that's so good. You're so right.
Mm-hmm.
That the exposure of being present to God's silence. And I don't know if anyone here has ever practiced centering prayer and done the centering prayer is entirely silent for a person to spend. It's supposed to be 20 minutes that you just sit in silence. And there's a feeling of exposure that's a part of that. That I have to set aside all of the stuff that is going on in my brain, and sometimes, stuff that is very unrelated to holy thoughts about God, a lot of distractions. And once I get sort of connected to that deep sense of silence, it is very intimate and very exposing. Yeah.
Sarah, could I mention something? This is Deborah Malma.
Sure, go ahead, Deborah.
I just wanted to mention that there is a centering prayer group. If there is anyone interested, Gail Phillips would be the contact.
Yeah.
And we meet on Wednesday evening between 5 and about 6:30. And it's exactly what Sarah was describing. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Yes, it's a group that's met for a long time. Thank you for that plug. So if you're interested in trying that, I would advise that group to you. Mark might know the answer to Stacy's question. Is there any sacred music based on Dickinson's poetry?
There are her poetry has been set to music numerous times. I can think of some choral works that are based around her poetry. Let me briefly, I know of a piece, her poem, Hope is a Thing with Feathers. And I'm looking it up as we speak.
I was in a band in college. It was like a noise rock band, and the singer read Emily Dickinson poetry.
Hey.
No.
Yeah.
Seriously?
It was awesome. Yeah, it was really super short lived. It was great.
I love that, actually.
There's actually a composer who lives at least used to live in North Carolina named Kenny Potter. Has a setting of Hope is a Thing with Feathers for choir. Another composer, Susan Labar. But there are many, many, many musical settings, some for, solo singers. I'm sure there are instrumental pieces of music that have her poetry as inspiration, as well as vocal and choral music. But yeah, her poetry is definitely something. And some of her kind of overtly sacred poetry, religious, spiritual poetry, is certainly things that have been visited by composers many, many times.
Yeah, great question. Okay, well, we are about out of time. And thank you all so much for being here and being a part of this conversation. Next week, Dixon and Julie Smith are going to be leading us in a similar discussion, and we're all looking forward to that.
We're going to do Green Eggs and Ham and Bell the Dragon from the Apocalypse.
Perfect. Love it.
I'm here for that.
See, that's kind of my speed with poetry anyway. Like, can we not just do, the places you will go and be done? Like, call it a day?
What else is there?
Okay, y'all. Well,